All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 7, Section 3, Debating Democracy. So again, just to quickly recap, we have the American Revolution, process of breaking away from Great Britain, which created the United States, and then the need to create governments. And the governments which were created or in need of being created was not just the government of the United States, a national government, but recall that within the United States, there were 13 individual states, right, at a state level. Colonies, now states. And so now each of those individual states needed their own governments as well. So when talking about creating new governments, we add our one national government, that would be the government of the whole United States, plus 13 state governments. There's going to be the creation of 14 different governments in the immediate aftermath of the Revolutionary period. 13 states, one national government. Now, we talked about in the previous sections kind of the different ideas about what a government ought to be, certainly what it shouldn't be. Shouldn't be a monarchy and isn't going to be a monarchy. But most agreed that it would be a republic, that is representatives. But really, the debate was how democratic should these governments be? And there's going to be some variation here between the states and between the state governments and the national government. Another very important idea that helped influence the creation of these governments was this notion of separation of powers. It's pretty straightforward that various powers within the government should be separated. This was put forward or typically credited to the French thinker Montesquieu. So Montesquieu, we'll just say a thinker who maybe popularized the separation of powers. And, this idea of separating powers was, very, very influential on people like John Adams, who wrote Thoughts on Government. John Adams, generally speaking, he was someone we might consider a conservative Whig. That is someone who, really sort of feared the excesses of democracy, but certainly supported a separation of powers. And this document, Thoughts on Government, would influence, we'll just say influence, other. John Adams was from Massachusetts, so he helped write the Massachusetts government, but his writings helped influence the other states. We'll say this influenced other states. And really what we mean by separation of powers is typically there are various branches to a government. The most kind of common, I guess, would be 3 branches. This is, in fact, the same 3 branches we have in our national government today and in many of our, I think maybe even all of our state governments. And that is, a branch called the executive. We might identify the executive today as the president or a governor on the state level. A legislative branch, that is the branch that makes laws, and then a judicial branch, something like the Supreme Court. And the idea is that each of these branches have certain powers. That way, none of them can sort of grow too powerful than the other. We also call this checks and balances. We refer to this sometimes as the 3 branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. So each of these branches are designed to check one or the other. And, this type of government would be a Republican government or a republic in which representatives would staff the government. And pretty much all sort of, most states and certainly, not really the national government, but most states would sort of adopt this idea of separating powers and having representatives for it. Then, like I mentioned before, the big question was, well, how democratic? And this is when things varied. So we're going to take the 2 kind of extremes of state governments to just give you kind of an idea of where all the other state governments kind of fell in line. So at one extreme, the Pennsylvania government was the most democratic. In the eyes of John Adams, this would have been, chaos and anarchy, according to him, but most democratic by Pennsylvania standards. Pennsylvania was different in that it didn't require any sort of property requirement when it came to vote or holding office. So no property needed to vote or hold office. This was way different. Most other states required some sort of ownership of property. There were other criteria that were there, but that was indeed different. That meant there was more participation. That means that it was more democratic. Unlike other states, there was no executive branch, right? So at least in the case of Pennsylvania, there was no executive branch. Again, for Pennsylvania, the fear was, maybe we might write this in the case of states, we're talking about governors, fear of a single ruler, right? Kind of like a king. So let's get rid of the executive branch. And that the legislative branch was unicameral, meaning a one house Congress. Whereas Adams and others, come on, go away. A one house Congress. Whereas in others, especially in the legislative branch, there were typically two houses, an upper and a lower. The lower house tended to be more democratic. The upper house tended to be a little bit more restrictive. And typically within a legislative branch, so this is within the legislative branch, these two would work together. Instead, Pennsylvania only had a lower, right? And this allowed for a much more democratic process. Meanwhile, compare that to some of the colonies in the South, like Maryland and South Carolina. Their requirements for holding office and voting, the wealth requirements that were there, were so high. So we might say wealth requirements so high, only 10% were eligible. So very undemocratic in a sense. And again, we should remind ourselves that at this particular time, women are not enfranchised. And for the most part, state and local laws will limit those who could participate to white males only or free white persons. So again, this 10% is only of those who are men and those who fall into the category of white. Now, that gives you kind of an idea of what state governments were like. So on the one end, something like Pennsylvania, which was considered to be very democratic, no executive branch because of fear of a king. It's all just the people, right? There's just one body of legislative branch, and it's just the people, having their will be compelled in that government. And then on the other end, Maryland and South Carolina, which have such high wealth requirements that practically nobody can participate in that government. And everywhere in between, Massachusetts was typically the kind of the more well-balanced government, you might say. And, there are sort of variations in between there. Now we're getting to the national government. And the Articles of Confederation is the first national government. Right? So this is the government of all the states, right? Of all the states. And kind of the most important thing to remember about the Articles of Confederation, and I put it as a question mark here, was that it was not a strong national government. So we want to answer this question with a resounding no, right? It was not a strong national government. It was a weak government for fear of central control. Now, we got to remember the historical context here. It's amazing how much historical context can inform us about the past. The 13 colonies had just got done fighting against and dying for a government to break away from a strong national power. The king, parliament, they believed were far too influential. So the last thing the colonists want to do is to create another strong national government. In fact, not colonists anymore, but Americans want to create a weak national government. Instead, the states are sovereign. And what does this mean? This pretty much means that the states, kind of think of the states as like their own individual countries, right? The states Sovereign, this is a good word to remember. That means like self-rule or the right to rule oneself. The states, the states are like independent countries. And instead, the Articles of Confederation is kind of like an alliance, right? Your textbook describes it as a league of friendship. It's just that all the states are friends with one another. That proved to be difficult in some ways because, as this image is pointing out here, the states could argue with one another. Here we have the various claims on Western lands by the state of Connecticut. You could see that other states laid claim to this territory as well. So sometimes the states could essentially fight one another. And not that they did very often, but it was hard to get kind of 13 countries who all think they're independent and sovereign to to work together. Now, the Articles of Confederation itself, the national government itself, was a unicameral legislature. This was just an extension of the Continental Congress. Right, and the Continental Congress was just a meeting of the states, right? Each state got to send a group of people to the Congress. They all met, 13 people there. And they had been meeting ever since the Declaration of Independence, even before that, and continued to meet during the course of the war. There was no president and no judicial system, right? So in terms of our separation of powers here, our executive, our legislative, and our judicial, in the Articles of Confederation government, there was no executive, there was no judicial. It was just a meeting of representatives from the colonies. And those representatives weren't even democratically elected. They were chosen by state governments. State governments pretty much chose who they wanted to send to the Congress, and that's what they called it. They simply just referred to it as the Congress. In terms of passing laws, how would laws be passed in the United States? 9 votes were required. This is 9 out of 13. Oops. This would be 9 out of 13, so it was hard to pass laws. Hard. Messing up all over the place. Hard to pass laws. So not a lot of laws got passed. And to amend the articles, amend means to change it. 13 out of 13 needed to approve. This was pretty much impossible. All right, so if they wanted to amend the articles, amend this document, make changes to it, all the states needed to agree. That was impossible. Again, the purpose here was to be very, very cautious about applying some sort of central law or policy to all the states, that you pretty much have to get everyone to agree on it if that's going to go into practice. The Articles of Government had a lot of things wrong with it, but primarily the biggest fault with it was where it stood on taxation. The national government could not tax. And that's going to become a big, big issue. The states could raise taxes themselves, but there was no power within the Congress to levy a tax on the entire United States. Given the poor financial health that the United States was in, recall we talked about last section that we could summarize the U.S. as having a bad economy. All right, that's to say the least. It was going to be difficult for the United States to pay off its debt obligations, right? There was a lot of war debt from the revolution. War debt owed to other nations, right? And war debt owed to, their own citizens. We might even call this soldiers. There were soldiers who had fought in the war, who had yet to be paid, and that was a problem. And so there were a group of people called the Nationalists, which included Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, who wanted to change the articles to solve economic problems. Right? They're sometimes called the New Nationalists too. But in other words, these are individuals who are looking at the very real problems, the problems of paying off war debt, the problems of trying to compete with Great Britain when it came to trade, the problems of trying to sign trade agreements with other nations. And the bottom line is that this government in the Articles of Confederation was not given the proper tools in order to fix the economic problems. And so, like I mentioned before, there is no national taxes. The national bank gets defeated. Salaries, we might say salaries of war vets go unpaid, right? These were all problems. So for the most part, one kind of slogan that we want to associate with the articles, even though we haven't quite got there yet, was that it was, let's go ahead and put it, let's go ahead and write it up here if you still have any room. Write it up here. The Articles of Confederation, maybe we'll use a different color. We want a failure color. I don't know if there is let's do it in red. Red always means danger. The Articles of Confederation was too weak to function, right? Too weak to function. So, the Confederation government fulfilled its obligation of being a weak government so that it didn't take over the United States, right? Again, that's what kind of people were fearful of. But the problem was that it was too weak, not just weak to, not be tyrannical over the United States, but it was too weak just to even work and function in sort of practical terms, right? In theory, it sounded good. In practical terms, there were many problems that could not be resolved. And so, it's essentially going to fail, right? There's a reason why we refer to this, the articles, where am I going? We refer to this as the first national government because we have a second, right? It didn't last. We have a second, and we'll get to what the second is. And the second government is actually the current government that we have today. For all of its failures, though, its failures on the economy, its failures on taxation, its failures on paying back veterans, there were some things that the Articles government did correct. The selling of Western land ordinances was the selling of Western land. This was one of the few areas in which the government could make money. You could see this image right here. They sort of just divvied up this land, divided it into little squares, and then sold it. That money was then used to pay down war debt. That was one way of raising revenue. This was also a way of settling that territory and doing it in an orderly manner. Eventually, for this thing to work, all the states had to give up on their territorial claims. So that was something that did happen. All the states finally got on the same page when it came to Western land. So that was a victory, you could say. And, like we mentioned before, this was one of the sort of rare ways that the United States could raise money. In particular, one of these ordinances, the Northwest Ordinance, is typically the one that is most commonly cited. This ordinance was important for a couple of reasons. First was that it created a system by which new and equal states, we'll just write this, equal states, would be admitted. And by equal, we mean equal to the original 13 states. So there was a big debate about whether or not there should be any additional states, whether there should only be 13 states forever, or should they add new ones? And if they added new ones, should those states be like secondary states because they weren't there at the beginning, right? They weren't original. The Northwest Ordinance said that new states would be added, gave a blueprint for how those new states would be added. It would be once those areas got a large enough population, they could apply for statehood. And those states would be on equal grounds in terms of power and representation as the original 13. So the process of turning territory into states and incorporating them into the government, that's essentially what the Northwest Ordinance did. It's also very important for another reason, because it also banned slavery. banned. Is there two N's in banned? Do button here. Banned slavery north of Ohio River, north of the Ohio River. And this was already revealing the dividing lines between the free states and the slave states. Here's the Ohio. So all this territory here, this was free soil. Slavery was illegal in that area and reflected the larger trend, you might say, of northern states moving towards the abolition of slavery while southern states continued to practice it. Now, the thing that made the articles, the weakness of the articles maybe more evident than anything else was Shays Rebellion. So we might say exposed the weakness or a weakness in the articles. So in addition to all the other problems with debts, the states themselves had a lot of issues, including the people who lived there. Farmers and veterans. Farmers had owed a lot of debt. Veterans had not been paid. The government had handed out essentially IOUs. And inflation, which is the printing of money, pretty much affected everyone. Each individual state printed their own currency, and nobody wants to get paid in paper. You want something of real value, gold and silver. And in Massachusetts, a bunch of farmers were being put in debt. Some of these farmers had been war veterans who had not yet been paid. And those governments there weren't really reacting to any of the troubled times that the farmers and veterans had been experiencing. And so Daniel Shays, who was a veteran of the Revolutionary War, led a rebellion, and he and his followers broke farmers out of jail who had been put there for not paying their debts, had attacked courtrooms, which were again going after farmers who had not yet paid their debts, and threatened the government of Massachusetts. On a national level, there was no strong national army. In other words, the only forces or troops that were able to deal with Shays Rebellion were those that were locally in Massachusetts, and that wasn't enough. And it was the chaos of Shays Rebellion and the lack of a strong national response, not just to the issues. It wasn't the fact that people were worried that farmers were being put in jail and people were worried that veterans weren't getting paid. They were worried that a group of veterans, farmers could cause so much problem that a government like Massachusetts was unable to deal with it, and a national army was unwilling to deal with it. And so George Washington, in the wake of Shays Rebellion, came out of retirement, and he began meeting with the New Nationalists to discuss possibly making changes to the Articles of Confederation. It was very clear that the stability of the nation was in question, and your Washingtons, your Hamiltons, and your Madisons will be talking and communicating, thinking about new ways to create a new government to deal with some of the problems the nation is facing.